What was a kamikaze pilot thinking in those final 10 seconds before slamming his plane into an American ship? While Japanese propaganda claimed they went to their deaths joyfully, the reality inside the cockpit was entirely different. Today, we reveal how American genius brought these fanatic waves to their knees and uncover the dark secrets inside those locked cockpits. Late 1944. The sun was setting on the Japanese Empire in the Pacific Theater. Faced with the massive aircraft carriers and invincible air power of the US Navy, the Japanese were losing every position. Cornered, the Empire deployed history's darkest and most tragic tactic, Tokkotai, better known to us as kamikaze. Young Japanese pilots were turning into human bombs, filling their planes with explosives and diving into American ships. The world had never seen such fanaticism. This wasn't just a suicide attack. It was the desperation cry of a civilization. Yet standing against this dark fanaticism were American sailors, fighting for freedom and pushing the boundaries of reason and technology. While the Japanese sanctified death, America defended life and victory.
The kamikaze tactic was the product of a psychological collapse rather than a military strategy. When the Japanese realized they couldn't stop American industrial might, they decided to use their pilots as human bullets. The first official attack occurred in 1944 at Leyte Gulf. Japanese propaganda claimed these pilots went to their deaths voluntarily and joyfully. However, the reality was quite different. When we look at the pilots' diaries, we see deep fear and helplessness blended with patriotism. America countered this chaos by developing revolutionary defense technologies like the Proximity Fuze, intercepting these suicide dives in mid-air. American genius was defeating fanaticism with science.
As the Japanese pilot lived his final seconds in the cockpit, he saw the majestic silhouette of American aircraft carriers and the American anti-aircraft fire tearing through the sky. This was a clash between an ancient dogma that saw death as an escape and American heroism that risked everything to protect the free world. When American radars detected these death birds on the horizon, they were defending not just ships, but human dignity. This bloody gamble of the Japanese would turn into nothing but fireballs against American steel. Do you think sacrificing one's life for a military objective is an act of courage or a failure of leadership? What do you think about the tragic end of these kamikaze pilots? Share your thoughts with us in the comments. And don't forget to subscribe to the channel to discover how the US Navy stopped this horror. A plane's cockpit, a deathly silence, save for the roar of the engine and the howl of the wind. When the point of no return journey began for a kamikaze pilot, what was racing through his mind? Although Japanese propaganda said they only shouted for the emperor, the truth was much more human and jarring. Farewell letters to their families, photos of loved ones, and the Japanese shores they would never see again. But these pilots saw only one thing in the sky, the majesty of the US Navy looming on the horizon. They had been told America was weak, but the massive firepower before them shattered that lie in seconds. American sailors stood by their guns with unshakable discipline against these suicide attacks.
The psychology of kamikaze pilots was shaped by heavy pressure and a distortion of the Bushido culture. Pilots were ceremonially served sake before their final takeoff and sent off as heroes. But the moment they stepped into the plane, they were alone. Many even considered returning under the guise of engine failure just before the dive. However, American anti-aircraft fire was so intense that it was nearly impossible for a pilot to maintain mental focus. America turned this mental pressure into a strategic advantage with radar networks and combat air patrols. While the Japanese sacrificed their pilots, America protected its own with the best training and technology.
As the dive began, it wasn't just the wind howling in the pilot's ears, but the sound of approaching American shells. The Empire, using the Japanese pilot as a bullet, was in fact consuming its own future. American sailors were defending not just their ships, but the great democracy they represented. While the final seconds in the cockpit passed with regret and fear for the pilot, every sailor on the American decks moved as one body to stop this fanatic attack. This death threat from the sky was destined to be crushed against American resolve and marksmanship, buried in the deep waters of the Pacific. As 1945 began, kamikaze attacks had evolved from individual suicides into mass destruction waves known as kikusui, or floating chrysanthemums. Hundreds of planes were swarming over American fleets simultaneously. However, there was one thing the Japanese hadn't accounted for: the unbreakable unity of American industry and science. When Japanese pilots commenced their death dives, they were met not just by fearless sailors, but by one of history's most secret and effective defense technologies, the VT Fuse, Proximity Fuze. These tiny radars allowed shells to explode the moment they were near an aircraft, without needing a direct hit. Suddenly, the sky would turn into a pitch-black cloud of gunpowder from American firepower, and fanatic Japanese pilots would disintegrate in mid-air before they could even get close to the ships. America was bringing a dogma that sanctified death to its knees with a science that defended life.
The Proximity Fuze was the most important secret weapon to determine the fate of the war, second only to the atomic bomb. Thanks to this technology, the accuracy of American anti-aircraft guns increased by 300%. While Japanese pilots tried to execute their final maneuvers in their cockpits, American radars were detecting them from miles away. On one side was Japanese logistics, which viewed its pilots as expendable parts. On the other was the American system, which viewed every single personnel, from the radar operator to the gunner, as the most valuable asset. American genius neutralized this asymmetric threat, not just by producing more weapons, but by producing smarter ones. This was an absolute victory of science over bigotry.
During that famous death dive, the last thing the Japanese pilot saw was not the ship's deck, but the hellfire created by thousands of surrounding American shells. While American sailors formed a protective shield around their ships, the Japanese Empire was incinerating its best-trained youth inside this shield. American power was crushing not only the enemy's body, but also the morale they aimed to destroy with these attacks. As the Pacific was stained red with Japanese blood, the U.S. Navy carried the flag of freedom higher with every wave. When a kamikaze plane managed to bypass all obstacles and strike an American ship, the real story of heroism began. While the deck was engulfed in flames, American sailors dove into the fire instead of running away. This was a discipline the Japanese could never understand. They thought everything was over once they hit an American ship. However, American damage control teams were so well trained and determined that they could make a sinking ship battle-ready again within hours. While a Japanese pilot thought of suicide in his cockpit, an American sailor thought of saving his comrade and keeping his ship alive. True military genius lies not just in the attack, but in the will to survive and rise again in the toughest moments. As the American flag continued to wave over burning decks, the Japanese suicide tactic was turning into a strategic fiasco against American resolve.
The damage control capability of the U.S. Navy was Japan's greatest strategic mistake. The Japanese assumed that once they hit a ship, it would be destroyed. Yet, American sailors, working in autonomous teams, were world-class experts at extinguishing fires and plugging holes. This organizational skill was a result of the emphasis the American system placed on individual initiative and teamwork. While the kamikaze pilot used his plane as a weapon to end his life, the American sailor held on to life by defending his ship like a fortress. America's sense of patriotism saw sacrifice not as an end, but as a tool for victory. This spirit was like a fortress that Japanese fanaticism could never tear down.
Even the massive explosion from a shell or a plane hitting the ship wasn't enough to shake the American spirit. Every single personnel on deck, from the radar technician to the cook, transformed into a warrior in that moment. While Japan sent its children to die, America sent its sons to win and save the world. As Japanese planes vanished one by one in the dark waters of the Pacific, American aircraft carriers patched their burning wounds and set sail for the next victory. The helplessness the Japanese pilot felt in his final seconds was actually a reflection of the deep crushing felt in the face of the greatness of American resolve. The Japanese propaganda machine portrayed kamikaze pilots as divine warriors heading to their deaths with eternal joy. However, diaries and farewell letters captured by American intelligence whispered a completely different drama as these young men lived their final seconds in the cockpit. Their minds held not the holiness of the emperor, but the faces of their mothers, the scent of their loved ones, and the springs they would never get to live. Many were forced to fly. Many were victims of intense social pressure. While they were driven through the sky like human bullets, the American aircraft carriers they saw before them were not just targets. They were symbols of the future Japan had lost, representing freedom and life energy. While the American sailor loaded his guns with the dream of returning home, the Japanese pilot had already left all hope of return outside the cockpit.
When examining the psychological profiles of kamikaze pilots, we see that a large portion were actually university students and educated youth. The Japanese military was accelerating its own end by sacrificing its qualified human resources one by one. Their letters frequently featured the theme, "I don't want to die, but I have no choice." This was an expression of absolute despair. On the other hand, America organized operations with rescue planes like the PBY Catalina just to pick up a single pilot from the sea, while America risked an entire fleet to save the life of one soldier. Japan was sending an entire generation to the bottom of the ocean. American genius measured the morale of its soldiers by the value it placed on their lives.
As the pilot began his dive, the final storm in his mind was cut short by the roar of American anti-aircraft guns. The regret of the Japanese pilot in his final moments collided with the resolve of the American sailor. On one side was an ideology that saw death as an obligation. On the other, the American spirit fighting to win back life. While Japan threw its children's future into the fire, America was being reborn in every wave of the Pacific to build that future. That fear in the pilot's final seconds was actually a sense of defeat felt against the massive life energy that America represented. Kamikaze attacks aimed to create not just physical damage, but also psychological pressure on the U.S. Navy. However, this is where American military genius stepped in. To keep the sailors' morale high, American psychologists and strategists trivialized the name kamikaze, even referring to them as flying coffins. The U.S. Navy didn't just play defense to stop these attacks. It targeted the very heart of Japan, the bases where these planes took off. American B-29 bombers and legendary carrier groups organized the largest air operations in history to crush the enemy's last card before it even left the ground. Japan's suicide strategy was fading one by one against America's proactive and aggressive strategy.
America viewed the kamikaze threat not just as a military problem, but as a logistical and psychological one. Combat Air Patrol, CAP units, intercepted Japanese planes long before they could approach the main fleet. Furthermore, with the early warning advantage provided by radar, American sailors began to see these attacks not as a surprise, but as a routine defense task. The Japanese hoped these attacks would force America to the negotiating table for peace, but the opposite happened. The American public and military united even further against this barbaric tactic. This Japanese fanaticism only reinforced America's decision for absolute victory. America destroyed the enemy's weak character and fanaticism by combining it with its own industrial power.
In the final months of the war, those screams from the sky were becoming rarer, because America had broken the enemy's wings not just in the air, but on the ground. As Japanese pilots looked at American ships in their final seconds, they were witnessing the sad and futile collapse of an empire. American sailors, meanwhile, saw victory on the horizon. The suicide waves of Japan were absorbed by American steel and American intelligence. Hearts beating for freedom buried those going blindly to their deaths into the darkness of history. The American Eagle was now ready for the final strike. When the last plane vanished into the bloody waters of the Pacific, and the engine roar finally fell silent, only burning wreckage and a profound stillness remained. The divine wind of the Japanese Empire had shattered against the impenetrable steel of the U.S. Navy. This was not just the end of a military operation. It was the absolute defeat of a dark dogma that glorified death at the hands of the American spirit that sanctifies life and liberty. The massive American flags that Japanese pilots saw in their final seconds were no longer just flying over ships, but were the heralds of a new dawn across the entire Pacific. The Pax Americana. While Japan consumed its future by sacrificing its youth one by one, America had revolutionized technology and medicine to keep every single sailor and pilot alive. This is true military genius, fighting not to die, but to live and to win.
The end of the kamikaze attacks bequeathed us one of history's greatest lessons. Following the war, the American administration chose to rebuild and modernize Japan rather than merely punish it. The fanatic ideology that had intoxicated Japan was purged, replaced by an American-style model of democracy and development. The fact that Japan is one of the world's largest economies today is a direct result of the American genius for building a future out of ruins in 1945. The American military didn't just stop the enemy in the Pacific. It demonstrated a vision grand enough to transform an enemy into an ally. America's true strength lies not just in its ability to destroy, but in its will to rebuild in peace.
When we look at the final letters of those pilots today, we can still hear that silence filled with fear. They were lost in the sky as victims of a wrong cause. However, the resolve of the American sailors in those moments remains the foundation of the free world today. Our steel ships, our radars, and our proximity fuses were not just weapons. They were shields protecting life. As the American Eagle ensured justice and peace on every island of the Pacific, no fanatic attack could halt that great march of liberty. Victory belonged to those who fought with the hope of returning home even in their final second. Victory belonged to those who defended life, not death. Victory belonged to America. Dear viewers, today we examined the dark psychology inside the kamikaze cockpits and how the U.S. Navy hunted down this horror one by one. History remembers those who protect and exalt their people, not those who sacrifice them. In your opinion, what is our greatest weapon against fanaticism in the modern world? Is it technology or an unshakable sense of ethics? Let's discuss this profound issue in the comments. To not miss these unforgettable moments of American military history and many more secret files, don't forget to like the video and subscribe to join the War Room Archives family. May your mind be clear and your path be freedom. God bless America.